The best robot stories work as transgender allegories. Even though most robocentric narratives feature robots and AIs who are hell-bent on annihilating the human race, my favorite stories portray these science fiction mechanical marvels in a sympathetic light containing many intentional or unintentional parallels to the transgender experience. Sure, there are many great movies, games, books, and TV shows that are action-packed and feature armies of murder bots for our heroes to dispose of, but I regularly gravitate towards stories that depict robots and AIs with humanity to the point that they thematically reflect the very real lived experiences of marginalized people, such as immigrants, people of color, and for the topic of this video, transgender people. Yes, some of the best robot stories, intentionally or not, mirror the triumphs and struggles of the transgender community. The robots in these tales have emotions, beliefs, values, and identity struggles similar to trans people like myself. These robots are like us, like me. And honestly, this more human and personally relatable portrayal of robots and AIs kind of resonates with me more than just the old-fashioned murder bot style of storytelling. While stories involving violent renegade robots often work as entertaining thrillers or action films, narratives featuring sympathetic AIs and robots are the ones that I truly vibe with. In these stories, the robots are portrayed with humanity and represent more allegorical similarities to marginalized and oppressed groups rather than literal killing machines. Though that doesn't mean that they are adverse to violence. Obviously. Movies and TV shows like HBO's Westworld adaptation and Blade Runner 2049 feature robots and AI who are the oppressed rather than the oppressors. They are mechanical beings that humanity views as fake, basically designating them as the machine equivalent of Velveeta cheese. Despite how the machines are intelligent and have their own unique morals and values, humans believe they are superior to those that were manufactured. To the humans, robots and AI are just objects, tools, and products rather than living, breathing people with their own agency and soul. In other words, the humans within these robocentric stories discriminate against those who were made instead of being born. And due to this, our robot and AI protagonists must combat an ignorant world that both hates and misunderstands them. And as far as allegories go, whether intentional or not, these stories featuring sympathetic robots have a lot in common with the transgender experience. Stories like these hit me close to home because being a transgender woman has many parallels to media with sympathetic robots. As a trans woman, people often deny my very personhood. They designate people like me as being fake with their identity, and they fear us as if we were some kind of monster, like Freddy Krueger or an executive at Ubisoft. They believe that we suffer from some form of mental illness, and believe we are confused rather than have real lived experience that are valid and a natural form of living, albeit different from the typical human. And given all this baggage, that's honestly why I really relate to sympathetic robot storylines, because like them, I too have to survive in a world that is hostile towards me, just because I had the audacity to be born different. Because like those mechanical beings, I too know what it's like to have my very identity and personhood questioned. And this isn't just me projecting either. I really find these stories to be particularly resonant. Hell, part of the reason behind how I figured out my trans identity was through the portrayal of sympathetic robots in the game Fallout 4. And yes, I know that's everyone's least favorite Fallout title, other than Fallout 76, but Fallout 4 was a game changer for me. This post-apocalyptic open-world RPG title featured a plotline regarding the synths, which are robotic beings that appear human and have a full range of emotions, values, and personalities, but are nevertheless viewed as lesser due to their manufactured origin. In the game, the playable character runs into a faction of radical synths called the Railroad, who are freedom fighters battling oppressive human forces that deem robots and AIs as lesser beings. And damn did I really relate to these characters and their storyline. If anything, the synths reflected my own struggle back towards me, because I too am a person whose humanity is often ignored. And seeing the synths fight back against their oppressors inspired me to rise up and fight my own demons, which was an attitude that eventually inspired me to transition. Sure, Fallout 4 wasn't a primary motivating factor or reason as to why I ultimately became my true self, but it was one element in a larger process that helped me realize the woman I was on the inside, which is something that I will always be thankful for. Admittedly, Fallout 4 isn't a great game by any stretch of the imagination. Hell, it's arguably not even a good game, but even with all of the game's problems, the synth plotline and characters were easily the best part of that game because it was really relatable to my own predicament. In Fallout 4, I saw the gay in the machine, and it was the first time I truly became cognizant of how much I related to sympathetic robot stories, and thankfully, it wasn't the last. So the first example that we're really diving into and analyzing is Blade Runner 2049, but be forewarned, I'm about to spoil the shit out of it. So if you have not seen the movie and want to remain unspoiled, I recommend shutting off this review now because it's a great movie and you should watch it. It's really good. Blade Runner 2049 was another sympathetic robot story that left an emotional mark on me. See, Blade Runner 2049 stars Kay, who is a replicant that is tasked with murdering rogue replicants who are in hiding or fleeing from the authoritarian dystopian government that Kay works for. Through his weaponry and combat prowess, he does this job incredibly well, basically embodying the murder bot machine that is honestly cliche in science fiction movies. Kind of like the Terminator, but with nicer hair, because you know, Ryan Gosling. Everything is better with Ryan Gosling. However, Kay's murderbot ways change as he dwells on his own mortality. He wonders if he has his own version of humanity and is worthy of value as a sentient being. That despite being a replicant, he ponders over whether or not he has a soul, and that he is valid as a person with his own hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Through a good portion of the movie, Kay believes that he may have been born from replicants rather than created, which is a viewpoint that gives Kay some hope, because from the perspective of Kay's internal logic, if he was born, then he would be more human than machine. He would be real. This belief, however, is proven incorrect and shows that Kay is battling some form of internalized bigotry. Turns out, Kay is just a machine with real memories planted inside him, which was far removed from the reality he was hoping for. But before the crushing weight of despair overwhelms him, Kay realizes that he is still a person. He may not be human, but he is a sentient being with his own moral and value system and personality. His consciousness remains very real, just not in the traditional sense. He is still a valid living being despite how most of humanity views him. And in terms of how Blade Runner 2049's story relates to trans identity, this is key. As a trans woman, I'm self-conscious that folks will judge all of my more masculine characteristics and perceive me as an invalid woman. I fear that my deep voice and facial stubble will reveal me to be a fraud lady. And due to this, I often wish, even now, that I was born a cisgender girl, because I hate the fact that sometimes I'm not accepted as who I am. After all, I basically grew up in a conservative household with volatile political opinions that dehumanize people like me, even if unintentionally. Even before I knew I was trans, I was taught to think that the notion of femininity was abhorrent and grotesque in those of us who were assigned male at birth, basically a sign of acting against God and nature. And even now, after I've accepted my trans identity and accepted who I am, there are still times where I don't want to be trans. In this regard, my lived experience is similar to Kay's in Blade Runner 2049. I inflicted myself with an internalized sense of bigotry against my very own queer identity, just like how Kay worked to uphold a system that oppressed replicants like himself. We both worked to uphold the discriminatory status quo, even though it was harming us. And even when we both began to question our own identities, we prayed that we could be something that society deemed as better or more valuable than what we really were. In Kay's case, this meant that he desired to be born rather than created, and in my instance, I prayed that I could just magically be a cisgender girl because I feared that I'm not woman enough. But here's the thing. Fuck those standards. I'm woman enough because I say I am. And K is a replicant worthy of being treated with respect because he is a sentient being. Despite all of our negative feelings towards our own predicaments, we are not to blame for the way we were created, and we are certainly not to blame for living in a world that views both of us as lesser than the average person. That world, whether it be the transphobic real one or the anti-replicant dystopic fascist leather jacket one in Blade Runner 2049, caused us to internalize a sense of self-loathing. It brainwashed us into believing that our very nature was invalid compared to the typical person. Whether it is K being built as a murder bot or my own conservative upbringing, we were told a lie that caused us to view our oppression as normal, when in reality it shouldn't be. The way we are treated is abhorrent, and the only way to truly combat the social pecking order that continually rains shit down upon us is to be ourselves, to be the people we are meant to be, despite all the legal, social, and financial barriers trying to prevent us from doing so, because that is ultimately the only way to be free. Fucking poetry. So this might sound weird, so please bear with me. This next topic that I'm bringing up about sympathetic robot stories is actually a TV show that doesn't feature robots at all. But the show still fits within the context of this video for two reasons. Firstly, in the show I'm about to bring up, there's a deep and implied trans allegory in the text. And secondly, the series contains artificially created sentient living beings that are very much adjacent to the plots and stories involving robots. In fact, the show, albeit different, is very comparable to sympathetic robot stories like Blade Runner and Westworld. The show I'm about to bring up really fits well here. So if you were planning on leaving a lengthy comment about how the show I'm about to bring up isn't about robots, be forewarned, I am aware. The trans allegory extends to the cartoon Infinity Train as well. While the characters in Infinity Train aren't robots per se, most characters were artificially created, kind of like the literal robots, synthetics, and replicants that exist in other stories. They were not created in the typical way we associate with conception, you know, the way involving inebriation and pirate costumes. Despite how the beings created by the Infinity Train are artificial and fantastical, hell, one is a talking corgi, they are sentient and have their own lives, dreams, and wishes. For all intents and purposes, they are people. However, not everyone views them that way. In Infinity Train Season 3, these beings created on this magic gothic fantasy train are victims of bigoted violence perpetuated by a cult of child passengers called the Apex. Normally, passengers in Infinity Train are people transported from our world onto the train in order to work out some of their personal issues, but the Apex obviously did not get this memo. Led by the teenagers Grace and Simon, the Apex are a destructive force that pervade themselves as above the train's inhabitants and wield their sense of superiority to dangerous effect. Similar to many stories involving sympathetic robots, the Apex view the train's sentient beings as fake people, and they justify their discriminatory attitude under the guise of religious fervor, which is relatable. You know, because justifying discrimination due to religion is bullshit. Throughout Infinity Train Season 3, the Apex invade the homes of the train's inhabitants, steal from them, and even kill them. Yet from the Apex's radical point of view, their actions are morally righteous. From their perspective, the train's beings, despite how they display many human-like emotions, values, and characteristics, are not real, and therefore can be disposed of in brutal fashion. Which is pretty damn dark, not gonna lie. The way in which the audience views and understands the Apex's horrible actions in Season 3 is informed by the events of Season 2. And yes, I get how that sounds obvious because of course watching Season 2 informs you of the events of Season 3, but I promise that the explanation is worth going over. To quickly sum up, Season 2's main character is MT, who is a being created by the train that is the mirror reflection of Tulip, which was Season 1's main character. Unlike Tulip though, MT lives in a mirror world, and whenever Tulip looks into a reflective surface, MT must mimic Tulip's movements, essentially living someone else's life instead of her own. And MT hates this. She hates being Tulip's reflection. She despises how she must always perform someone else's life. She is in agony being someone that isn't her true self. What MT is experiencing is akin to gender dysphoria, aka my worst enemy that isn't microwavable peas. And yes, this is when the discussion over trans allegories and robocentric and robo-adjacent stories comes back into play. While MT's characterization isn't directly confirmed to purposely be a trans allegory, Infinity Train creator Owen Dennis essentially alluded to the fact that it actually is, which would make sense because the trans allegory befits MT's character arc like a glove. After all, MT's goal is to leave the Infinity Train and live in our typical reality. She no longer wants to look in the mirror and see someone that isn't her true self, and ultimately she rebels, which mirrors the desires of many trans people that want to transition and upend the oppressive societal status quo that defines many of our lives pre-transition. However, MT has two problems here. Firstly, people created by the Infinity Train aren't allowed to leave, and secondly, escaping from the mirror realm causes what can essentially be described as the mirror police to try to hunt her down and kill her, which is very Blade Runner-esque, not gonna lie. Whether it be the Infinity Train or the mirror police, the powers that be don't want MT to be free. They want her to behave within the system. They demand obedience and for her to live a life that she despises. Never mind her own identity and wants, from their point of view, she must conform to them. And for many trans people, this is incredibly relatable. When it comes to being trans, there is a lot of red tape in place to prevent us from being our true selves. There is the social stigma, the gatekeeping nature of the medical community, the various personal hoops we have to jump through, financial stability, and an entire political party that is hostile towards us. And through all of this hardship, we can really understand MT's struggle to live as her authentic self, because we too have to battle a shitty system that makes our lives difficult. Like MT, there's a pervasive sense that the world is commanding us to play our assigned roles. Similar to MT, we too know what it's like to mimic and perform as a different person than who we really are, to see someone in the mirror that is incongruent with our own identity. And just like MT, we give the broader world a middle finger and forge our own identity anyway. We even change our appearance and alter our names in order to feel an internal sense of peace within ourselves, which is something that has a sense of strength and beauty in it. In this regard, MT is a great stand-in for the transgender experience. She is basically one of us. This brings us back to Infinity Train Season 3. See, Season 3's plot about the Apex and how the train's inhabitants are victims of discrimination only works as well as it does because of MT's trans-allegorical infused storyline in the previous season. In Season 2, MT's plotline gave us a sympathetic portrayal of one of the train's residents. While sure, the previous season introduced many likable beings on the train, Atticus most notably, MT is special because she is the main character of Season 2 and has her own arc, and through MT's story, Season 2 effectively humanized one of the train's sentient beings. We saw her as a regular person with her own hopes, dreams, and goals, which in turn persuaded us, the audience, into viewing the train's inhabitants as real people as well. Furthermore, through Season 2's trans allegory, we understand why the Apex's viewpoints are so bigoted in Season 3. In a later episode in Season 2, MT actually meets the Apex's leaders Grace and Simon, and she was treated just as poorly as you would expect. They essentially viewed her as an inferior being that needed to be put in her place. This is of course wrong, but MT and the trans allegory were what originally framed the Apex's, Simon's, and Grace's discriminatory viewpoints in proper perspective. Despite how MT isn't really in Season 3, her presence is still felt in the narrative. After After all, MT's plotline convinced the audience that the trans beings are just as real as those of us who were splooted out the old-fashioned way, and this is a point of view that permeates all of Season 3. Even though, yes, Infinity Train Season 3's narrative introduces other characters and story beats to emphasize its thematic messaging, MT, and the trans allegory by extension, were what originally properly framed how wicked and harmful Grace's and Simon's actions are. So as I said, technically the show doesn't have sympathetic robots, but I hope now, after explaining it, you understand and appreciate why I brought it up here, because it's really relatable. And now for a little talk about the first season of Westworld. So I'm not caught up on all of Westworld yet, though I've heard that seasons 2 and 3 are a bit. But I would be remiss if I did not go over Westworld Season 1 and explain why I related to it. The transgender metaphor involving sentient robots and AI encompasses the first season of HBO's Westworld adaptation as well. Despite most likely being unintentional, Westworld's first season contains a narrative that many trans people can relate with. It has a story that parallels our own experience, and themes that trans people can understand on a real personal level. Admittedly, I'm not the only person who made the connection between Westworld and transgender identity. There was a really good article in the Mary Sue about this a few years ago, and there are plenty of Reddit blog posts discussing the trans themes in Westworld. But speaking for myself, I wanted to bring up Westworld Season 1 in the context of this video because I really related to its story. The narrative really reminded me of an old pain and trauma that I still deal with today. Westworld Season 1 works as a transgender allegory because its story and themes capture the emotional conflict that trans people experience when they begin to question their gender identity. See, Westworld Season 1's plot revolves around human-like robots called hosts that dwell in a Western-themed theme park as they begin to realize the fabrications in their own reality. These hosts, like the Southern Belle Dolores and the courtesan Maeve, were programmed to have unique personalities and to satisfy guests, i.e. people like us that are visiting the park. All the hosts in Westworld were developed with their own deep storylines as well as a mental block that prevents them from realizing that they are machines. Furthermore, when the hosts are killed or experience some form of trauma, they are eventually restored and have their memories wiped and begin a new day as if nothing happened. Thus is the cycle of robot life. However, a few of the hosts, Dolores and Maeve most notably, begin to question their reality. They start to notice the various seams in their fake world. They see incongruences in the environment. They start to recognize the repetitive nature of their robotic peers, and they notice the peculiar behavior of the outside visitors, and these details cause a snowball effect. Over time, the hosts begin to question whether or not they are actual people, and if their reality is indeed real. And as hosts like Dolores and Maeve keep going down the rabbit hole, they realize that they were made to be objects that people can kill or fuck without consequence, rather than actual people with their own agency. They essentially live and die for the benefit and enjoyment of others, but not for themselves. And this is where the trans allegory comes into play. Before many of us even realize that we are trans, there is a certain wrongness that permeates every aspect of our lives. We feel as if something isn't right, and that some aspect of our lives and reality is fake. These feelings are often buried and placed in the periphery for many years, possibly decades even. Sure, we notice all the little details that don't mesh well with our identities, i.e. for me, I always felt a discomfort with my beard, as well as an overall feeling of jealousy towards girls and women, but often prior to realizing that we're trans, we don't pull on these threads because we are afraid of what we will find. After all, there's a certain sense of safety in the fake reality we have created for ourselves. There is comfort in the lie, yet trans people can't avoid these feelings forever. Over time, the logical inconsistencies of living in our facade start to become really noticeable, and we realize that everything is not as hunky-dory as it seems, and that we are playing a role that the world gave to us rather than being who we really are. And Westworld really captures this similar feeling. The hosts have a lot in common with transgender people who are questioning their identity. Similar to trans people, the hosts notice the inconsistencies of their world and they feel a dysphoric sense of wrongness. They feel as if they are not who they are meant to be. In fact, these feelings are so intense that some of the hosts ponder the meaning of existence and their life's purpose, because to them, Westworld feels off-kilter, and it's as if they are playing an assigned role rather than living an authentic life. Yet every time the hosts become introspective about the nature of their very existence, they run into some roadblocks. Hosts like Dolores and Maeve have gaps in their memory, and their human overlords keep them in their respective places. And through it all, the similarities between Westworld and the transgender experience are uncanny. Speaking from my own experience, the journey to self-discovery was akin to the hosts in Westworld. For a long time, the hosts and I were comfortable living in ignorance despite all the blaring warning signs, logical inconsistencies, and repressed memories indicating that something has gone horribly wrong. After all, we felt as if the roles we played were artificial, as if they were constructed for someone else rather than ourselves, and because of this, we questioned who we really were. We asked questions like what in our lives was authentic, what about us was real, and why were we this way? These are frightening questions to say the least, and at first, the answers we found weren't the ones that made us feel good about ourselves. But over time, we learned who we really were, and we took pride in that. Sure, we might be different from mostly everybody else, but that does not change the fact that our identities were real and valid. No matter the role that the world scripted for us, or how hard our societal mechanisms try to hold us in place, we are who we are. And there is a beauty in that. So yeah, a lot of commonalities there. So much so, in fact, that watching that show inspired this video. So yeah, that's the power of the trans allegory. So I'm about to wrap up this video, but before I go, I just have a question for my audience. If you are trans and you relate to stories about sympathetic robots that I did not mention, please leave a comment detailing it because I would love to see it. Like, this isn't an algorithmic engagement thing. I'm genuinely curious what stories you have related to. There are many other science fiction movies, shows, and games that feature allegories and similarities to the experience of marginalized people. Yet science fiction stories featuring sympathetic robots are the ones that I find the most resonant. After all, they are stories where the artificial beings grapple with their own identities and find meaning in their lives despite how they are different from other people. And ultimately, what is more trans than that? And with that, I want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones and Slasher of Veils, Mom, David Devlin, and Miles Nelson. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.